A Walk in the Sun wasn't just Lewis Milestone's follow-up to All Quiet on the Western Front. It was a production where the producer lost everything to creditors mid-filming, where Samuel Fuller wrote Milestone an angry letter calling it an abomination, and where Daryl Zanuck delayed release for a year because Japan surrendered and stopped all war films. What you watched was Dana Andrews leading a platoon across 6 miles of Italian countryside. What you didn't see was a film shot mostly on treadmills on a soundstage, a technical advisor who'd been captured at Kasserine Pass, and the army demanding script changes to explain why they didn't use the bazooka. This wasn't typical war propaganda, it was character study disguised as combat film. Here are 20 weird, shocking, and unknown facts about A Walk in the Sun that reveal how Milestone created an intimate war film that divided critics and influenced everything from The Thin Red Line to Saving Private Ryan. And stick around for the bonus fact because the film was deemed culturally significant by the Library of Congress in 2016. Number 20, producer Samuel Bronston lost the film to creditors mid-production. Samuel Bronston purchased the film rights to Harry Brown's novel in September 1944 and began production in October with Lewis Milestone as co-producer and director. The production seemed stable initially, with Bronston financing the project through standard industry channels. But in November, Bronston obtained a $500,000 mortgage loan from Walter Heller and Company, an Ideal Factoring Corporation, to cover escalating production costs. When the lenders discovered that the film couldn't be completed on the originally allocated budget, they foreclosed in early January 1945 and took over the project completely. This was devastating for Bronston, who'd invested significant personal resources and professional capital in the production. Superior Productions, which included Milestone, assumed control and completed filming. Bronston filed a lawsuit and eventually received an out-of-court settlement of 21.25% of the film's profits, far less than he would have earned as producer. The financial disaster nearly killed the production before it could be completed and served as a painful lesson about the dangers of independent production during wartime when resources were scarce and budgets unpredictable. Number 19. Samuel Fuller wrote Milestone an angry letter, calling the film an abomination. Samuel Fuller, a decorated World War II infantryman with extensive Italian campaign combat experience, wrote Lewis Milestone after seeing the finished film. Fuller's letter was scathingly honest, essentially asking how the director of All Quiet on the Western Front, universally recognized as the greatest film about war's reality, could make such an abomination. The criticism cut deep because it came from someone who'd actually experienced the combat Milestone was attempting to depict. Fuller's critique focused on the film's unrealistic depiction of infantry combat. He found the soldiers' behavior unconvincing, their deployment illogical, and their casual attitudes impossible for men actually under fire. For a veteran who'd experienced actual Italian campaign combat, Milestone's poetic approach felt like betrayal of soldiers' real experiences. Fuller believed that war films had responsibility to depict combat honestly rather than aesthetically. The letter created lasting tension between two filmmakers who'd both tried depicting war honestly but from completely different perspectives, Fuller from direct experience, Milestone from artistic interpretation. The disagreement represented fundamental debate about whether war films should prioritize documentary realism or emotional truth. Fuller would later make his own war films, The Steel Helmet, Fixed Bayonets, that emphasize gritty realism over poetry. Number 18. The Army demanded script changes to explain why bazookas weren't used. Army officials cooperating with the production complained that bazookas would have been used when the platoon stormed the farmhouse during the final assault. According to the April 19, 1945 Hollywood Citizen News, Milestone added a sequence where the platoon expends all bazooka ammunition during an attack on a German armored car and 2 tanks specifically to satisfy the Army's technical complaint about proper weapons usage. The Army also requested additional scenes showing officers being properly briefed before the invasion. They wanted to demonstrate that American military planning was thorough and professional, not the chaotic improvisation that Milestone's script suggested. Milestone shot this prologue in January 1945, adding Carl O'Brien to play the briefing captain. However, that sequence doesn't appear in the finished film, suggesting Milestone shot it to appease the Army censors but quietly cut it during editing once he'd secured their approval. The Army's interference demonstrated the fine line filmmakers walked during wartime production. Military cooperation was essential for access to equipment, locations, and technical expertise. But that cooperation came with strings attached. The military wanted films that boosted morale and portrayed American forces competently. Milestone wanted to explore fear, confusion, and the psychological reality of combat. The compromise satisfied neither completely, but allowed the film to be made. Number 17. The technical advisor was captured at Kasserine Pass. Colonel Thomas D. Drake served as the film's technical advisor, bringing unique credentials to the production. Drake had risen from private to sergeant during World War I, was later commissioned as an officer, and eventually commanded the 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division in North Africa. He and his entire regiment were captured by German forces at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, America's first major defeat in the North African campaign and a humiliating introduction to combat against experienced German forces. Drake's experience gave him unique perspective on military failure and leadership under pressure. He'd commanded a regiment that was overwhelmed, captured, and spent the war as POW. His presence ensured tactical details remained authentic, even as Milestone pursued poetic rather than documentary approach. The advisor who'd been captured by the enemy brought humility and realism that tempered Milestone's artistic ambitions. Drake understood that battles didn't always go according to plan, that leadership could fail, and that even well-trained units could be defeated. His influence shows in the film's willingness to depict confusion, fear, and the breakdown of command structure. Unlike advisors who'd only experienced victories, Drake brought hard-won knowledge about what happens when things go wrong. Number 16. Daryl Zanuck stopped all war films when Japan surrendered. Though 20th Century Fox acquired the finished film for release in July 1945, head of production Daryl F. Zanuck stopped production and release of all war films when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war's sudden end made combat films seem obsolete or inappropriate. Audiences wanted to move on, not relive battles they'd just finished fighting. The film sat completed but unreleased for nearly a year, finished but stranded by history. The delay actually proved fortunate. Released in June 1946 to audiences with some emotional distance from combat, the film received critical and popular acclaim, rather than being lost in the glut of wartime propaganda that flooded theaters during 1943 to 1945. The year's delay transformed A Walk in the Sun from timely propaganda into something approaching art, a reflective piece about experiences audiences could now contemplate, rather than something demanding immediate emotional response. Zanuck's decision affected numerous war films in Fox's pipeline. The studio had invested heavily in war pictures, believing the conflict would continue longer. When it ended suddenly, those investments seemed worthless. Only the best films, including A Walk in the Sun, eventually received proper releases after the cooling-off period. Number 15. The film was shot at Fox Ranch alongside Abel Ferrandino. Principal photography took place at 20th Century Fox's ranch in Calabasas and Agoura, areas that are now completely developed suburban Los Angeles but were open ranchland in 1945. The film shot simultaneously alongside Fox's production of Abel Ferrandino, another Italian campaign film starring John Hodiak and Gene Tierney. The shared resources kept costs manageable despite Bronston's financial collapse. The Fox Ranch provided convincing Italian countryside without expensive overseas location work. Milestone used the terrain, natural light, and existing landscapes to create authenticity that sound stages couldn't replicate. The California locations doubled believably for the Salerno region, proving that careful cinematography and production design could transform domestic locations into foreign battlefields without audiences noticing the deception. The ranch's rolling hills, dirt roads, and rustic structures all contributed to the illusion of Italy. Cinematographer Russell Harlan shot in available light whenever possible, giving the film naturalistic look that enhanced the realism. The outdoor locations also allowed Milestone to shoot long tracking shots following soldiers through landscape, his signature technique that created immersive experience. Number 14. Most walking scenes were filmed on treadmills on soundstages. Despite extensive location work, much of the actual walking was filmed on soundstages using treadmills. Critics and careful viewers have noted that Rivera and his ammo bearer walk at brisk pace, while the man behind trudges more slowly, yet the distance between them never changes, an obvious sign of treadmill filming where background moves but soldiers remain stationary. The treadmill technique saves substantial money while allowing Milestone complete control over lighting, camera placement, and dialogue recording. Recording clean dialogue outdoors in 1945 was challenging. Treadmill work on soundstages eliminated wind noise, ambient sound, and other technical problems. The approach limited visual scope, but enabled intimate focus on characters' faces and conversations during the long march sequences. The compromise between realism and practicality defined the entire production, authentic when possible, theatrical when necessary. Milestone balanced location authenticity with soundstage control, creating hybrid that emphasized character psychology over documentary realism. The treadmill scenes worked because Milestone kept camera tight on faces where the real drama happened rather than pulling back to reveal the artifice. Number 13. Burgess Meredith narrated and persuaded Bronston to produce the film. Burgess Meredith, who eventually provided the film's philosophical narration, was the catalyst who persuaded his friend Samuel Bronston to produce a film based on Harry Brown's novel. Meredith had read the novel when it was serialized in Liberty magazine and recognized its cinematic potential. His enthusiasm convinced Bronston to pursue the rights, beginning the entire troubled production. Meredith's narration provides philosophical commentary throughout the film, transforming combat footage into meditative rumination on war, fear, and mortality. His voiceover doesn't explain what's happening. Audiences can see that, but interprets the emotional and psychological meaning of events. The technique was literary rather than cinematic, but it worked because Meredith's delivery was thoughtful rather than bombastic. The ballads, composed by Millard Lampell with music by Earl Robinson and sung by Kenneth Spencer, complement Meredith's narration, creating dual layers of poetic commentary. The combination of voiceover, ballads, and visual storytelling created unique structure that influenced later war films seeking to elevate combat beyond simple action sequences into something more contemplative and philosophical. Number 12. Robert Rossen's screenplay follows Harry Brown's novel very closely. Robert Rossen, who would become a director himself the following year with Body and Soul, adapted Brown's novel with unusual fidelity to the source material. Brown had been a writer for Yank, the army weekly based in England, and his novel drew from stories he'd heard from soldiers returning from Italy. The book was serialized in Liberty magazine in October 1944, making it extremely timely material when Bronston purchased the film rights. The close adaptation preserved Brown's focus on individual psychology over action spectacle. The novel was essentially a character study of men under pressure, and Rossen's screenplay maintained that emphasis even though Hollywood convention demanded more action. The result felt more literary than cinematic dialogue. Heavy sequences where the camera watches soldiers talking rather than fighting dominated the narrative. Rossen would go on to write and direct acclaimed films like All the King's Men and The Hustler, but A Walk in the Sun represented his breakthrough as serious screenwriter capable of adapting literary material without compromising its substance. The screenplay demonstrated that war films could be as much about conversation and reflection as combat and heroism. Number 11. The cast included future film Noir stars. The ensemble lineup included Dana Andrews, Richard Conte, John Ireland, Lloyd Bridges, Norman Lloyd, and Richard Benedict, actors who were becoming familiar faces in noir pictures and would dominate that genre over the next decade. Their presence contributed to the film's sense of absurdism and existential dread. These weren't traditional square-jawed heroes, but morally complex men navigating ambiguous situations with limited information. Andrews had already starred in Laura, 1944, and would appear in The Best Years of Our Lives later in 1946. Conte would become noir staple in films like The Big Combo. Ireland would appear in All the King's Men and countless westerns. Their casting suggested Milestone understood that war films and crime films shared thematic DNA. Both explored men under pressure, making difficult choices in hostile environments where traditional morality offered little guidance. The actors brought noir sensibilities to war film, the cynicism, the world, weariness, the sense that survival required compromising ideals. Their performances made A Walk in the Sun feel less like propaganda and more like honest examination of what combat does to men's souls. Number 10. The platoon's mission was unrealistically small scale. With small budget and few military resources available from the Army, Milestone made this intensely personal. But the combat logic suffered. What beachhead mission would send only 20 men 6 miles inland to knock out a tiny bridge and capture a farmhouse? The resistance they encounter is minimal. One armored vehicle, one strafing fighter plane, and a farmhouse with stubborn but limited defenders. A bigger battle remains over a hill, constantly referenced but never seen. The limited scope forced Milestone to focus on character rather than spectacle. Unable to afford large battle scenes with hundreds of extras, tanks, and artillery, he made virtue of necessity by emphasizing soldiers' internal experiences over external action. The small-scale mission became metaphor for every soldier's limited perspective during war. You only see what's immediately around you, never the bigger picture. Critics noted the tactical implausibility, but defenders argued that the point was psychological rather than strategic. The film wasn't about whether the mission made military sense, but about how ordinary men coped with fear, leadership challenges, and the grinding stress of moving through hostile territory where death could come from any direction at any moment. Number 9. Bosley Crowther singled out Dana Andrews for praise. In his New York Times review, Crowther praised Dana Andrews among what he characterized as a generally superlative cast. Andrews played Sergeant Bill Tyne, who assumes command after the lieutenant and then the senior sergeant both break down under stress. The performance required balancing authority with vulnerability. Tyne doesn't want command but accepts it because someone must, and he's the only one capable. Andrews brought quiet intensity to the role, playing Tyne as man who'd rather follow orders than give them but rises to necessity. The performance was internal rather than showy. Andrews conveyed leadership through subtle gestures, tone of voice, and body language rather than heroic speeches. This restraint made Tyne feel authentic, like the thousands of reluctant leaders who found themselves commanding units because everyone above them had been killed or incapacitated. Modern critics might argue that Andrews was upstaged by Richard Conte's more colorful performance as Rivera, the Jersey-born Italian, American soldier who provides comic relief and emotional intensity. Conte brought energy and wit that contrasted with Andrews' stoicism. The different performance styles created productive tension. Tyne's reserved leadership versus Rivera's expressive personality reflected the platoon's diversity of temperaments and backgrounds. Number 8. The film portrays German soldiers as neutral rather than demonized. Unusually for a 1945 war film, A Walk in the Sun provides neutral texture to the enemy. German soldiers appear as shadows and silhouettes rather than monsters with twisted faces. They're professional soldiers doing their jobs, not evil incarnate. This was radical departure from most wartime films that demonize the enemy to maintain audience hatred and support for the war effort. The neutrality reflected Milestone's anti-war convictions inherited from his work on All Quiet on the Western Front. He understood that soldiers on both sides experienced similar fears, followed orders from distant commanders, and fundamentally wanted to survive and return home. The refusal to dehumanize the enemy was artistically mature, but commercially risky during wartime when audiences expected villains worthy of hatred. The Germans in A Walk in the Sun defend their positions competently, retreat when tactically necessary, and fight without theatrical cruelty. They're obstacles rather than monsters. This approach anticipated later war films that acknowledged the common humanity of soldiers regardless of uniform, though it wouldn't become standard until decades later when emotional distance from World War II allowed more nuanced portrayals. Number 7. Herbert Rudley's Sergeant Porter has a nervous breakdown. One of the film's most powerful and controversial sequences shows Sergeant Eddie Porter succumbing to panic and shell shock after assuming command. It's perhaps the kindest cinematic treatment of combat stress disorder presented during the 1940s. The platoon appears supportive of the fallen sergeant rather than judgmental, remarkable for 1945 when psychological casualties were often stigmatized as cowardice or weakness. The portrayal acknowledged that leadership could crack under pressure, that fear was universal and could overwhelm even experienced soldiers, and that mental breakdown didn't indicate moral failure. Rudley played the breakdown with dignity rather than melodrama, making Porter's collapse feel inevitable rather than shameful. The sequence showed Porter's increasing anxiety, his inability to make decisions, and finally, his complete psychological retreat from responsibility. The sympathetic treatment was progressive for its time. Most war films depicted shell shock as individual failure rather than legitimate injury. A Walk in the Sun suggested that combat stress was a predictable consequence of unbearable psychological pressure, and that anyone could break under sufficient strain. The sequence influenced later war films' more honest depictions of combat trauma, though it would take decades for PTSD to be officially recognized as legitimate combat injury. Number 6. The film emphasizes soldiers' fears rather than heroism. Unlike most war movies where heroism transcends fear, these soldiers are consistently afraid throughout the mission. They acknowledge their terror openly, discuss it with each other, and struggle to maintain composure. The honesty about fear was revolutionary for 1945 war cinema, which typically portrayed American soldiers as brave to the point of fearlessness. The film argues that courage isn't absence of fear, but action despite fear. Every soldier admits to being scared. Rivera jokes about it nervously. Tyne quietly acknowledges it. Younger soldiers confess it openly. The heroism comes from continuing the mission anyway, from functioning despite terror, from not allowing fear to paralyze them into inaction. This redefinition of courage felt more authentic to combat veterans who knew that everyone was afraid and that bravery meant functioning despite overwhelming terror. The constant discussion of fear also served practical, dramatic purpose. It maintained tension during long sequences without combat. The walking scenes could have been boring, but the soldiers' ongoing conversations about their fear, their desire to survive, and their doubts about the mission kept audiences engaged emotionally, even when nothing was exploding on screen. Number 5. Milestone reused his signature tracking shot from All Quiet. Milestone employed the filming technique that had shocked audiences in All Quiet on the Western Front, extended tracking shots following soldiers through combat and movement. The technique created immersive experience where viewers felt like platoon members rather than distant observers watching from safe remove. The camera becomes another soldier, moving with the unit, seeing what they see, sharing their perspective. The tracking shots in A Walk in the Sun lack the revolutionary impact they'd had in 1930s All Quiet on the Western Front, but they demonstrated Milestone's continued commitment to putting audiences in soldiers' perspectives rather than maintaining objective distance. The camera moves with the men during their long march, follows them into the farmhouse assault, and stays close during moments of crisis and decision. The technique influenced later war filmmakers who understood that camera placement was ideological choice. Distant shots emphasized spectacle, while close tracking shots emphasized human experience. Milestone's approach prioritized soldiers' subjectivity over strategic overview, making audiences feel the confusion, fear, and limited perspective that defined actual combat experience, where soldiers rarely understood the bigger tactical picture. Number 4. The film was released on Christmas Day, 1946. After year-long delay caused by Zanuck's decision to halt war film releases, A Walk in the Sun finally premiered on December 25, 1946, Christmas Day. The holiday release seemed odd for a war film, but by late 1946, Americans were ready to reflect on the war they'd won, rather than simply celebrating victory. The film offered contemplative rather than celebratory approach that matched the nation's mood. The Christmas release positioned it as serious adult drama worthy of holiday consideration rather than exploitation picture or routine action film. Fox treated it as prestige picture deserving of Oscar attention. The strategy worked, critical response was overwhelmingly strong, and the film found appreciative audience hungry for thoughtful rather than triumphalist war films. The timing also benefited from distance from combat's end. 18 months after victory, audiences could engage with war films intellectually rather than purely emotionally. The film's emphasis on fear, confusion, and psychological breakdown wouldn't have worked during wartime when audiences needed reassurance and inspiration. But in late 1946, its honesty felt refreshing rather than demoralizing. Number 3. The ballads create unique narrative structure. The ballads sung by Kenneth Spencer provide running commentary on the action, creating emotional and intellectual distance between viewer and events. The songs aren't diegetic, characters don't hear them, but function as poetic interpretation of what we're witnessing. Combined with Burgess Meredith's narration, the ballads transform combat into myth, elevating specific events into universal statements about war and human nature. The musical choices were unusual for 1945 war films, which typically used martial music to heighten excitement or patriotic sentiment. Instead, the ballads are mournful and reflective, commenting ironically on the action rather than reinforcing it. The technique anticipated Stanley Kubrick's use of incongruous music in Full Metal Jacket, and other films that recognize music could complicate rather than simply accompany visual narrative. The songs also served structural purpose, marking transitions between sequences and providing rhythmic pacing during long stretches without dialogue. The ballad form itself, storytelling through song, reinforced the film's literary rather than purely cinematic approach. The combination of voiceover narration, sung ballads, and visual storytelling created layered narrative that operated simultaneously on multiple levels. Number 2. The film pioneered intimate war film that influenced modern cinema. A Walk in the Sun proved that war films could emphasize character over spectacle, psychology over action, and conversation over combat. The approach was controversial in 1945, but became increasingly influential over subsequent decades. The film demonstrated that war movies could be as much about waiting, thinking, and talking as fighting, that the psychological experience of combat deserved as much attention as the physical violence. The long stretches of dialogue between brief bursts of action created rhythm that felt more authentic to actual combat, long periods of tension and boredom punctuated by moments of terror. This pattern anticipated Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, which similarly focused on soldiers' internal experiences and philosophical reflections during lulls in combat. Both films understood that war was primarily psychological experience rather than continuous action. The influence extends to numerous modern war films that prioritize character development over spectacle. Saving Private Ryan's opening battle sequence is intense action, but much of the film consists of soldiers walking and talking, dealing with fear and moral complications. The Hurt Locker focuses on psychological tension rather than constant combat. These films owe debt to A Walk in the Sun's demonstration that intimate, character-focused war films could be artistically and commercially viable. Number 1. The film was selected for National Film Registry in 2016. The Library of Congress selected A Walk in the Sun for preservation in the United States National Film Registry in 2016 as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. This recognition came 70 years after release, vindicating Milestone's artistic approach over Samuel Fuller's criticisms and proving that the film's influence had only grown with time. The selection acknowledged the film's pioneering, intimate approach to war cinema. What seemed small, scale, and uncommercial in 1946 became recognized as deliberately focused, a film about universal soldier experiences rather than grand strategy or spectacular battles. The National Film Registry preservation ensures the film remains accessible for future generations of filmmakers, scholars, and audiences interested in how war cinema evolved from propaganda to art. The recognition also validated Milestone's career, long commitment to anti-war filmmaking. From All Quiet on the Western Front through A Walk in the Sun to Pork Chop Hill, Milestone consistently portrayed war as tragedy rather than adventure, emphasizing human cost over strategic victory. The Library of Congress selection confirmed that this perspective deserved preservation as essential American cultural heritage. Bonus fact: the restored version reveals details lost for decades. Kit Parker Films and MVD Visual released a definitive restoration on Blu-ray in January 2022. The 2K restoration brought the image quality back to pristine condition, revealing Russell Harland's cinematography in unprecedented clarity. Details in faces, landscapes, and lighting that had been obscured in degraded prints became visible again. Film historian Alan K. Rode provided commentary track covering the controversial filmmakers, unusual production circumstances, and the film's difficult path to recognition. The restoration introduced new audiences to a film that had been difficult to see in quality presentations for decades. Sony's previous DVD version looked like a piece of shit, according to multiple critics, but the restoration's visual qualities shone through beautifully. The film's influence on modern war cinema became clearer when viewed in proper quality. The careful compositions, the naturalistic lighting, the intimate focus on faces all demonstrated Milestone's craftsmanship. The restoration also included supplemental materials documenting the film's production history, critical reception, and legacy. These extras contextualized the film for modern viewers unfamiliar with 1940s war filmmaking conventions and demonstrated how radically A Walk in the Sun departed from those conventions. A Walk in the Sun endures because Lewis Milestone understood that war films could be intimate rather than epic, introspective rather than action, packed, honest about fear rather than celebrating false heroism. He created a film that Samuel Fuller hated, but that influenced generations of filmmakers who recognized that the smallest stories often reveal the largest truths about combat, courage, and what happens to men when institutions collapse and survival depends on improvised leadership.